It was in Venice on the banks of the Grand Canal that one could sometimes glimpse her in her final years. Peggy Guggenheim, wrapped in dark cloth, her small Lhasa Apso dogs weaving around her ankles, walked with a slow dignity past her collection of paintings. Around her hung the wild visions of artists once dismissed as mad, the canvases of Pollock, Ernst, and Miro. The city outside shimmered with light on the water, yet within her palazzo there was always an air of something unresolved, as if the art itself whispered fragments of her past. Welcome, dear listener, to this gathering of memory. Before we begin, I invite you to share in the comments when and where you are listening, for together we are weaving a tapestry of time, connecting across the world. If you wish, support this channel by pressing the subscribe button and let us now drift together into the story. Peggy Guggenheim was born in 1898 into a house gilded with the wealth of New York's mercantile dynasties. Yet almost from the first breath, shadows stretched across her childhood. She was the daughter of Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the wealthy heirs of a mining fortune, and Florette Seligman, herself from a distinguished banking family. Their world was one of heavy curtains, formal meals, and unspoken distances. Though she entered life as a child of privilege, one must not assume privilege shields the heart. From the beginning, Peggy would learn that riches can magnify absence rather than diminish it. Her father, Benjamin, lived with flair, indulging in extravagances that dazzled many but left the family unsettled. He was a man drawn to adventure, restless even at home. In 1912, when Peggy was just a young girl, Benjamin boarded the Titanic. He was among the many who never returned. For the Guggenheim family, news came in broken fragments, whispers, telegrams, delayed reports. To imagine the child Peggy, standing in that heavy New York townhouse waiting for footsteps that would never return, is to glimpse the moment when her life tilted toward loss. The sea took him, and with him vanished not only a father, but a sense of security that money could never replace. This wound never closed. It is said that in later years, Peggy often confessed to feeling abandoned, unloved, uncertain of her own worth. Could it be that the absence of a father, lost in the cold Atlantic waters, left her forever seeking warmth in the arms of others? It is tempting to think so. Her life became a restless journey of searching, one that never allowed her stillness. Her mother, Florette, was not a figure of tenderness. She was distant, strict, perhaps hardened by the sorrow of widowhood. Peggy grew up in a house where affection was scarce, where silence weighed heavily on the rooms. In that silence, a child can turn either to obedience or rebellion. Peggy, in time, chose rebellion. When she turned 21, she inherited a portion of the Guggenheim fortune. It was a small share compared to her cousins, who built grand museums and legacies of wealth, but it was enough to grant her freedom. With this inheritance, she began to look beyond the rigid manners of New York society, beyond the tea rooms and the formal dances. What use were these rituals when she already carried in her chest the knowledge that life could sink in a single night, like her father's ship beneath the black waters? There is an image I often return to when I think of Peggy at this age, a young woman, slender, with dark hair and searching eyes, walking down Fifth Avenue while the sound of jazz leaks from a passing car window. The air is filled with the pulse of the 1920s, with the energy of change. She carries with her the weight of the Guggenheim name, yet also an inner pull towards something she cannot yet define. Wealth opens doors, yes, but it also builds cages. Was she stepping into freedom or into another kind of prison? She moved awkwardly within New York society. The Guggenheims were powerful, yet Peggy lacked the refinement expected of her. Some whispered she was plain, others that she was eccentric. In her diaries and later recollections, she spoke of feeling unseen, overshadowed by her wealth, but not truly valued for herself. How cruel it is to have both abundance and invisibility. One wonders if she ever looked into a mirror in those years and asked herself who she truly was beneath the name. And yet, even then, the scent of escape was in the air. Europe beckoned. Paris in the 1920s was alive with a new kind of energy, one that laughed at conventions, where artists and writers filled smoky cafes, arguing about dreams, politics, and beauty. For Peggy, New York must have felt like a room that was too tight, its walls closing in, while across the ocean, Paris shimmered like an open window. It is here, at the threshold of her journey, that we must pause. Childhood shaped by loss, wealth tainted with absence, a young woman who longed for escape but did not yet know where it would lead. The world outside was moving fast with revolutions in art and culture, with the roar of jazz and the quiet whispers of modernism. And Peggy stood waiting, restless, as if listening to a call that only she could hear. In the stillness of those early years, the sea remained. The same sea that had swallowed her father now separated her from the life she was destined to find. Did she see in its waves both danger and promise? Perhaps she did. And so her story begins not with triumph, but with absence, with a girl marked by loss, searching for love in a world that seemed unwilling to offer it freely. And as we close this first part of her tale, let us imagine the sound of the Atlantic at night, its endless, rolling, dark, and unbroken. That sound will remain beneath every chapter of her life, a reminder of what she lost and of what she was always trying to replace. The sound of the Atlantic at night, rolling endlessly against unseen shores, fades into another rhythm, a rhythm that belongs not to the sea, but to a city, alive with its own tides. New York in the years after the Great War was no longer the place of solemn mourning Peggy had known as a child. By the early 1920s, the streets had begun to vibrate with new energy, the laughter of flappers, the hiss of motor cars, the rising hum of jazz drifting from nightclubs where people danced away the memory of war. For Peggy, still young and unformed, these sounds carried the suggestion of escape, of lives less burdened, of a world that might hold her too. Yet even within this new rhythm, she felt herself displaced. The Guggenheim fortune offered her entry into society, but her heart remained outside its doors. She wandered through drawing rooms, listening to conversations that seemed to her both empty and endless. The women spoke of fashion, the men of business ventures, while she stood at the edge, uncertain whether to lean in or to flee. There was no real laughter in these spaces, only the polished performance of it. What must it feel like, she wondered, to truly belong? Her mother expected her to settle into this world, to marry well, to become a respectable ornament of her class. But Peggy's inheritance had given her a different kind of freedom, a freedom to disobey. And slowly, quietly, she began to imagine life elsewhere. It was a bookshop that first opened the door. On a quiet street far from the grand avenues, Peggy encountered a small shop where the works of radical European writers lay piled in unsteady towers. There were poems by Rilke, novels by Joyce, and whispers of movements stirring across the ocean. She would take these books home and read late into the night, the sounds of the city outside her window, while her mind drifted across continents. Paris appeared in these pages like a vision, cafes crowded with voices, artists living by instinct rather than rule, the pulse of an existence both dangerous and free. And so the Atlantic, once only the sea that had taken her father, became also the passage toward possibility. She would cross it not as a child of mourning, but as a seeker, though she did not yet know what she sought. In 1921, at the age of 23, Peggy boarded a ship to Europe. The voyage was long, and she spent hours on deck staring at the horizon, the salt air cutting her skin, the memory of her father never far from thought. Did she imagine him then? Somewhere beneath those same waters, watching as she made the crossing he never could? The ocean held both loss and promise, and in her mind they could not be untangled. Paris greeted her with noise, with smoke, with laughter spilling from the Montparnasse cafes, where artists and poets had gathered in defiance of convention. The war had shaken faith in the old order, and here, in these narrow streets, a new one was being improvised nightly. Women wore their hair short, men painted visions that rejected reason, writers filled pages with the strange music of stream of consciousness. It was a world that seemed, at last, to breathe with the restlessness Peggy carried inside herself. She rented a modest room, far from the luxury her name could have commanded, and she began to live among those who had chosen poverty for the sake of freedom. She was awkward at first, uncertain in conversation, too shy to insert herself into the confident debates that swirled around the tables of cafes. Yet she listened, and listening, she learned. The voices of Ezra Pound, Man Ray, Marcel Duchamp, and Juna Barnes filled her evenings. They spoke of breaking traditions, of art as a rebellion, of love as an experiment. And slowly, Peggy, who had once been the silent figure at New York dinners, began to find her place among them. She was not an artist herself, but perhaps she could be something else, something that mattered. What was it that drew her most strongly? Was it the paintings pinned to damp walls, the smell of turpentine and cigarettes, the wild conversation spilling into dawn? Or was it the sense that here, in Paris, one could remake oneself entirely, shedding the weight of family expectation like an old garment? The question lingers, and perhaps even Peggy could never have answered it fully. But she knew with certainty that this world held something she had long been missing. In these early years, she drifted between lovers and friendships, never staying still, always searching. The men she encountered were often brilliant, often cruel, and always consumed by their work. To love an artist was to live in their shadow, and Peggy accepted this, even sought it. For in their passion for creation, she saw something she could not find within herself. She began to measure her worth by proximity, by being the companion, the supporter, the one who remained present while genius unfolded. Was this strength, or was it the echo of her childhood loneliness, the desire to be necessary to someone, anyone, who might not leave? Money, too, played its strange role. In America, her wealth had been a cage. In Paris, it became a key. She could pay a painter's rent, she could buy a meal for friends, she could sustain the gatherings where art and love intermingled. Yet she often felt uneasy about this power. Did they welcome her for herself, or only for what she could give? She admitted in later years that doubt never left her. But she also confessed she could not stop. To support others was the way she kept her own darkness at bay. The 1920s unfolded like a dream, nights spent in smoky rooms where words spilled faster than wine, mornings walking home under gray skies with her shoes damp from rain. She collected not yet paintings, but moments, impressions, the feeling of belonging to something new. And yet, beneath the laughter, there was always the undertow of loss, the memory of the father who had vanished into the sea. It is possible that every embrace, every friendship, every gesture of generosity carried within it the unspoken plea not to be abandoned again. She would soon marry, though marriage for Peggy was never sanctuary. Lawrence Vail, the American writer she chose, embodied the chaos she both feared and craved. But that belongs to another chapter of her tale. For now, in these first Paris years, she stood on the threshold of herself, not yet the collector she would become, not yet the eccentric figure in Venice, but a young woman leaning forward into possibility, her eyes lit by the strange and marvelous figures who surrounded her. And as we leave her here, standing in a Parisian street with the dawn breaking pale against the rooftops, the sound of jazz still echoing faintly from a nightclub now closed, we sense the shift. The Atlantic is behind her, the life of New York already fading. Ahead lies love, pain, art, and the beginning of her true becoming. Yet for the moment, she is simply there, breathing in the smoke of the city, uncertain, restless, and alive. The pale light of dawn on Paris rooftops lingers, thin and uncertain, as if the city itself hesitates before beginning another day. Peggy walked home through narrow streets, the smell of stale smoke clinging to her coat, her shoes damp from the night rain. She felt neither entirely awake nor entirely asleep, as though her life had become an in-between state, drifting from one evening to the next, between one gathering and the following one. Paris in the 1920s was a city that rarely rested, and she too learned to rest less, to live instead on the rhythm of others. The cafes of Montparnasse became her school. She was not an artist, not a writer, not one of the creators who drew sketches on scraps of paper between sips of bitter coffee. She was an onlooker at first, a presence in the corner, listening to arguments that flowed with the intensity of scripture. Ezra Pound speaking of poetry like a machine, Duchamp turning even silence into provocation, Man Ray describing photographs as if they were fragments of dreams. Peggy listened, not always understanding, but feeling herself pulled closer, like a moth circling the edge of flame. There was a freedom in their voices that contrasted with the rigid society she had known in New York. Here, rules seemed to dissolve. Artists lived on borrowed money, slept in cold rooms, painted on discarded canvases, yet they spoke as though they owned the future. Their poverty was not shame but badge, proof that they had chosen truth over comfort. Peggy, with her inheritance, stood in uneasy relation to this world. She could pay for meals, she could lend rent, she could even buy a painting, but she could not erase the difference that separated her from those who created. And so she found herself constantly questioning, was she part of them or forever outside? She moved among them, yet the question lingered like smoke. It was not only money that marked her difference, but also her need for love, a need so deep it often blurred into desperation. She longed to be wanted, not merely for what she gave, but for herself. Yet the men she encountered were rarely gentle. They were restless, consumed by their work, treating affection as another experiment, another brief diversion before the next canvas or page. Peggy yielded perhaps too easily, for yielding was her way of remaining close. Some evenings she laughed, her voice carrying across the tables, her eyes bright with wine. Other nights she walked home alone, clutching her coat tightly, wondering why she felt so hollow when surrounded by so many. Juna Barnes, sharp-tongued and observant, once told her she lived like a candle burning at both ends, trying to give light to everyone and leaving nothing for herself. Peggy never forgot those words, yet she could not stop. She wandered from one circle to another, always searching for a place where she might belong fully. It was not simply companionship she craved, but meaning. She sensed that in art lay something akin to salvation, though she did not yet know in what form. Collecting had not yet become her calling, but already she was drawn to the act of choosing, of holding on to what others might overlook. When an artist showed her a sketch or a fragment, she studied it with intensity, as if glimpsing something hidden beneath the surface. She did not yet realize that this instinct, the ability to see value where others saw chaos, would one day shape her destiny. For now, she lived in drift. Paris offered her friendships that burned brightly and then vanished, affairs that left her both exhilarated and bruised, conversations that seemed to open the universe and yet dissolved with morning light. She became known in these circles, not as a creator, but as someone who believed in creation. It is not a small role, though she often underestimated it. Without figures like Peggy, how many artists would have gone unheard, their visions buried beneath poverty? And yet, she herself often felt invisible, a background figure to the dramas of others. What does it mean to belong? Is it enough to be present, to witness, to support? Or must one create something tangible, a work that bears one's name, to claim a place in history? Peggy wrestled with these questions silently, her answers shifting as often as her affections. She was already a collector in spirit, though not yet in deed, gathering experiences, people, memories, storing them within herself as if they were treasures. Perhaps this was her art, the art of remembrance, of gathering, of preserving what might otherwise pass away unnoticed. In the background of these years, the world itself trembled with change. The Great War had ended, but its shadow lingered. In Germany, inflation devoured savings. In Italy, fascism gathered force. Yet in Paris, there was a strange suspension, as though time had been borrowed, as though laughter and experimentation might postpone the darker tides. Peggy, still in her 20s, floated within this borrowed time. She dressed simply, often feeling less elegant than the women around her, but her presence was felt. She asked questions that revealed more than they concealed. She stared at canvases longer than others did, not out of knowledge, but out of hunger. One evening, while watching Man Ray adjust a photograph under red light, Peggy remarked that the image seemed like a memory one could never return to, a thought fragile and fleeting. Man Ray laughed, dismissing her words as naive, yet the comment lingered. It was in such small observations that Peggy's sensibility revealed itself, not technical, not scholarly, but intuitive. She saw art not as theory, but as mirror, reflecting her own inner absences and desires. The night stretched endlessly, yet time moved quickly. By the mid-1920s, Peggy had become deeply enmeshed in the bohemian life of Paris. She was no longer only the Guggenheim heiress who had crossed the Atlantic. She was Peggy, known for her generosity, her curiosity, her willingness to embrace the unusual. And yet, within herself, she remained unsettled. She had found a world that promised belonging, but the promise was always just beyond reach. As dawn once again broke across the rooftops, she felt the same question pressing upon her. Was she truly part of this world, or merely passing through it? The cigarette smoke, the laughter, the bold declarations of genius, they surrounded her. But did they include her? She did not know. Perhaps she never would. And so we leave her once more, standing at the threshold of her own identity, her footsteps echoing on cobblestones as she returns to her small rented room. Behind her, the cafe doors close, the voices fade, the city falls into brief silence before the cycle begins again. And in that silence, the doubt lingers, unresolved, like a note held too long on a violin string. The silence after the cafes had closed was never lasting. Soon enough it was broken again, not by the distant hum of jazz or the scratch of pens in smoky rooms, but by the sharper sound of arguments carried behind closed doors, by the clatter of broken glass, by voices raised too high to be mistaken for conversation. For Peggy, the quiet drifting of her early Paris years began to shift into something heavier, something with the force of entanglement. She had moved from the edge of the circle into its heart, and it was there that she met Lawrence Vail. Lawrence was a writer, American by birth but restless by nature. He moved through rooms with the presence of someone both charismatic and unpredictable, quick with words, quick also with temper. To those who admired him, he was brilliant, a man capable of capturing the absurdities of modern life with biting humor. To those who feared him, he was reckless, volatile, dangerous in the way storms are dangerous. To Peggy, he was at first irresistible. They married in 1922, a choice that seemed at once inevitable and ruinous. Peggy was not drawn to safety. She was drawn to intensity. Lawrence offered her that in abundance. Their life together was less a partnership than a storm. At times, laughter filled their rooms, wild and intoxicating. But just as often, anger cracked through like lightning. Lawrence drank heavily, his moods shifting without warning, and Peggy, who had always longed for closeness, found herself both embraced and wounded by the man she had chosen. It is difficult to say why she stayed as long as she did. Was it love, or was it the echo of childhood loss, the fear of abandonment that kept her clinging to him, even when he turned cruel? Perhaps it was also the belief that chaos was proof of passion, that only in turbulence could one be truly alive. Many women of her time would have sought stability, but Peggy never desired stability. She desired intensity, even when it left her bruised. Their marriage produced children, and for a time Peggy attempted to live within the role expected of her. She was a wife, a mother, a woman tending to the needs of her family, but the role fit her poorly. Domesticity, with its endless cycles of meals and duties, seemed a prison to her restless spirit. She adored her children, yet even there she felt herself falter, her own wounds making it difficult to provide the steady affection she longed to give. Later, her daughter Peggy would recall the absence she felt, the hunger for a mother's love that never quite reached her. The pattern of loss repeated itself quietly across generations. Meanwhile, Lawrence grew more volatile. He was jealous, controlling, his rage unpredictable. At gatherings, he might be the center of brilliance one moment and the cause of humiliation the next. Friends watched uneasily, unsure whether to intervene. Peggy endured, but each year the weight grew heavier. She once confessed that she felt trapped between the fear of leaving and the fear of staying, as though either choice would lead to ruin. And yet, even in the storm, there were moments of strange clarity. Lawrence, for all his destructiveness, was also a writer, and through him Peggy came to understand more deeply the lives of artists. She witnessed the cost of creation, the way obsession consumed those who pursued it, the way art and madness sometimes overlapped. She saw, too, the fragility of genius, how easily it could collapse under its own weight. These observations, though painful, would later guide her in recognizing the balance required to nurture artists without being devoured by them. The 1920s moved forward, bright on the surface, darker beneath. Europe danced to the rhythms of liberation, yet political tensions gathered. In the small rooms of Montparnasse, however, the storms that mattered were personal, and Peggy's was among the most violent. She bore the marks of it quietly, carrying both the bruises and the questions they raised. Why had she chosen him? Why had she stayed? Why did love, which she longed for so deeply, arrive always entwined with suffering? Perhaps she saw in Lawrence something that mirrored her own inner turmoil. He, too, was restless, unsatisfied, always reaching beyond what was given. In that sense, they were alike. Yet likeness does not always bring harmony. Sometimes it brings only collision. Their marriage became precisely that, a collision of two unsettled souls, each seeking what the other could not provide. By the early 1930s, Peggy could endure no longer. The laughter had grown thin, the violence too frequent, the wounds too deep. She left Lawrence carrying with her both children and scars. Divorce in those years was no small scandal, but Peggy cared little for scandal. She had lived with scandal within her own walls. The judgment of society was a lesser price to pay. And so she entered another silence, this one heavier than before. Alone, she reflected on what had passed. Had she failed, or had she survived? The line was unclear. What was certain was that love, as she had known it, had left her both wounded and hardened. She had learned something in those years, though she might not yet have been able to name it, that to give herself entirely to another was to risk erasure. If she was to find meaning, it must come from elsewhere, not from the arms of a man who could not hold her without breaking her. And here, in this space of aftermath, another path began to open. Freed from the prison of marriage, Peggy turned again toward art. She began to collect not as a pastime, but as a calling, as though by surrounding herself with works of vision, she could rebuild the self that had been damaged. The canvases she chose spoke to her of possibilities beyond her wounds, of beauty born out of chaos. Perhaps this was her way of proving to herself that destruction need not be the final word. The sound that lingers at the end of this chapter is not the crash of glass or the raised voice of argument, but something quieter, the brush of paint across canvas, the slow creation of form from nothing. It is the sound of beginnings, fragile but insistent, rising from the silence left by the storm. The sound of a brush across canvas, quiet and steady, replaces the echoes of storm. It is a sound that belongs not to violence, but to creation. And though Peggy herself never held the brush, she found solace in its rhythm. After leaving Lawrence, she stood in the uncertain space of one who has survived, but not yet found direction. The years of marriage had left her wounded, stripped of illusions, but they had also given her something unexpected, an intimacy with the world of artists, an understanding of their struggles, and a sense that perhaps her own place in life was not to create, but to guard and to nurture what others created. Her inheritance remained, though diminished by the expenses of life and marriage. It was enough to give her independence, but Peggy had little interest in living as a passive heiress. She did not wish to decorate herself with jewels or to pass her days in the salons of society women. Such roles were prisons, gilded but confining, and she had already known too much captivity. What she longed for was purpose, a thread that might tie her life together, something to make sense of the losses and storms that had defined her path thus far. It was in art that she began to glimpse such a thread. In the early 1930s, she moved among studios and galleries in Paris, visiting the homes of painters whose names at the time were spoken more with curiosity than reverence. She watched them work in cramped rooms, their canvases stacked against walls, their brushes worn to stubs. The smell of turpentine and oil paint became as familiar to her as the scent of bread or coffee. She began to see that these works, so fragile in their beginnings, carried within them an intensity, a defiance against despair, not unlike her own. Her first acquisitions were modest, impulsive even. A sketch here, a small painting there, bought less from calculation than from instinct. She often said she chose works because they moved her, because they stirred something in her chest that words could not reach. To others, her choices seemed strange. Why buy such unsettling, distorted figures? Why hang such peculiar abstractions in one's home? Yet Peggy was not seeking decoration. She was seeking reflection. In the fractured shapes of modern art, she saw fragments of her own unsettled life, assembled into something that, however uneasy, carried beauty. She opened herself to the artists too, not only their works. Many of them were poor, living from commission to commission, uncertain whether their visions would ever be valued. Peggy supported them quietly, sometimes with money, sometimes simply by listening, by believing. Her presence was not always easy, for she was demanding in her own way, her need for love entangled with her role as patron. Yet the artists understood that she was genuine. She did not collect for prestige, not yet. She collected because she felt compelled, as though failing to preserve these works would be to abandon something essential. Still, doubt shadowed her. Was she truly doing something of value, or was she merely filling the void left by broken love? Did she collect out of devotion to art, or out of fear of emptiness? Perhaps both. She admitted to herself that collecting gave her identity, that it allowed her to define herself not as abandoned child or failed wife, but as someone with a calling. Yet she also knew the hunger within her was never fully satisfied, no matter how many canvases hung upon her walls. By the mid-1930s, Peggy began to think of opening a gallery of her own. She had seen how others dismissed the artists she admired, how museums clung to tradition, how critics sneered at abstraction and surrealism. Perhaps, she thought, she could create a space where new visions might be seen without ridicule. The idea frightened her, for she had no formal training, no credentials, and little confidence in herself. But she had instinct, and instinct, she believed, was often the truest guide. In 1938, she opened her first gallery in London, calling it Guggenheim Jeune. The choice of city may seem curious, for London was hardly the center of avant-garde art at the time, but perhaps that was precisely why it mattered. The gallery was small, the resources limited, yet Peggy poured herself into it. She organized exhibitions, bringing to London the works of Jean Cocteau, Kandinsky, Yves Tanguy, and other figures whose names carried whispers of scandal and brilliance. The reception was mixed. Some mocked her, others were bewildered, but a few began to see that she had an eye. For Peggy, the gallery was more than a venture. It was a declaration. She was no longer only a figure drifting among artists. She was positioning herself as one who could shape their destinies. Yet even as she gained confidence, her personal life remained unsettled. Lovers came and went, each affair a mixture of longing and disappointment. The pattern repeated itself, passion followed by rupture, tenderness shadowed by cruelty. She could not seem to escape the cycle of seeking in others what she could never find, and so, perhaps, art became her most faithful companion. The paintings did not leave. They did not betray. They remained, holding their strange truths quietly, waiting for her return. Each acquisition was like a pact, a promise between her and the vision of another. In this way, she built not only a collection but a sanctuary, though she may not yet have realized its full significance. Looking back, one can see how these years marked a turning point. From the chaos of her marriage, Peggy had turned toward creation, not her own, but the creation of others, which she chose to protect and elevate. It was as if she had discovered that while love between people so often failed her, love of art might endure. Was it enough? Could paintings and sculptures fill the absence left by human touch? The question lingered, unresolved, even as her collection grew. And so we end this chapter with an image. Peggy, standing in her London gallery after an opening, the guests gone, the glasses half empty on tables, the smell of smoke still hanging in the air. She walks slowly past the walls, pausing before each painting, her hand reaching as if to touch but stopping just short. Alone, she studies the works she has chosen as though seeking in them some reflection of herself. The silence of the room is deep, yet it is no longer empty. It is filled with the quiet presence of art, and in that presence, she feels, if only for a moment, less alone. Her hand hovered just short of the painted surface, pausing in that fragile space between presence and touch, as though she feared breaking the spell by contact. Paintings could not wound her as lovers did, yet still she longed to feel them against her skin. It was in that same fragile space that she soon encountered another figure, this time not on canvas but in life itself, who would leave her marked in ways no collection could soothe. His name was Samuel Beckett. Beckett was younger than she, Irish by birth, sharp of mind and quiet of manner. He carried within him the weight of a silence that was not emptiness, but depth, a silence that suggested worlds unspoken. He had come to Paris to live among writers and thinkers, his pockets often empty, but his mind luminous. When Peggy met him in the late 1930s, she was drawn immediately to the gravity of his presence, so different from the boastful volatility of Lawrence Vale or the flamboyance of the artists who surrounded her. Beckett was reserved, almost austere, yet there was an intensity in his gaze that pulled her toward him. Their affair began swiftly, as so many of hers did, but with Beckett it carried a different tone. He was not generous with affection, nor reckless with declarations. He offered her something colder, sharper, more elusive, a love that was intellectual as much as physical, one that existed in fragments rather than in fullness. Peggy, forever longing for closeness, pursued him with all the fervor of her hunger. She gave, and he withheld. She opened, and he withdrew. This dance, painful as it was, bound her to him more tightly than the embraces of men who had overwhelmed her with passion. In the quiet of her London gallery, after hours when the world seemed still, Beckett would sit with her in silence, both of them staring at canvases that seemed to echo their own disquiet. Sometimes he spoke of literature, of Joyce, of the futility of language, of the absurdity of existence. His words were not consolations, but mirrors, reflecting back to Peggy the uncertainty she already carried. Yet even in this, she found herself compelled. To her, Beckett was both wound and salve, a man who offered nothing and by that very nothingness made her crave everything. She followed him to Paris, unwilling to let him slip away. There were nights of deep passion, nights of bitterness, and nights when she wept at his indifference. He was not cruel in the way Lawrence had been, not violent or explosive, but he was absent even when near, as though a part of him always remained beyond her reach. Peggy once said that Beckett made her feel both more alive and more alone than she had ever felt before. Perhaps this was his gift and his curse, to awaken in her an intensity that left her hollow once he retreated. During these years, the world itself was shifting into despair. The clouds of war gathered once again, shadows falling across Europe. The fragile exuberance of the 1920s had long faded, and now the 30s closed in with their menace. Hitler's rise in Germany, the march of fascism across Italy and Spain, the growing sense that catastrophe was inevitable, these weighed on every conversation, every gathering, every plan. For Peggy, who had once sought only personal escape in art and love, history now intruded. She could not drift endlessly in cafes and studios when the world itself threatened to collapse. Beckett, too, felt this darkness, and it marked his writing with even greater austerity. He would later join the French resistance, risking his life against oppression. But in these earlier days, he remained the quiet, shadowed figure beside her, unwilling to promise, unable to offer certainty. Peggy clung to him, hoping his brilliance might also bring her stability. But brilliance is rarely a stable thing. Her gallery in London suffered too. Visitors came, curious but skeptical, often leaving with puzzled faces. Modern art remained a scandal to many, and Peggy's determination to support it marked her as eccentric, even reckless. Critics mocked, friends questioned, but she pressed on. Beckett encouraged her in this, though not always directly. His way of believing in her was oblique, found in a single phrase, a glance, a moment of silence shared before a canvas. He did not build her confidence, but neither did he dismiss it. He simply allowed her to be, which, for Peggy, was sometimes enough. Still, the love between them was unsustainable. Peggy wanted devotion. Beckett could not give it. She wanted warmth. He offered distance. She wanted to be seen entirely, and he, perhaps afraid of being consumed, looked away. Their affair ended, as so many of Peggy's affairs ended, with sorrow and unanswered questions. Yet Beckett never entirely left her. His voice, his silence, his way of shaping absence into meaning lingered. She carried him within her even after their bodies no longer entwined. What does it mean to be haunted by someone who is still alive? Peggy knew. Beckett became one of her many ghosts, not dead but gone, leaving traces in her memory that surfaced unbidden in later years. She admitted long afterward that he was one of the few men she truly loved, though he had never given her the love she sought. Perhaps that is why she loved him, because he remained beyond her reach, and thus beyond disappointment. In the aftermath of Beckett, Peggy turned again to her collection, as though art could fill the void he left. She acquired more works, sought out new artists, poured her hunger into canvases instead of embraces. Yet even there the question lingered. Was she collecting out of vision or out of longing? Could it be both? She never answered fully, nor perhaps did she need to. And so we leave her once more, standing in the half-lit gallery, Beckett's shadow lingering in the air like smoke. The canvases around her are silent, yet within their silence lies an echo of him, the man who gave her nothing and yet left her changed. Outside, the world darkens toward war, and inside Peggy waits, uncertain, her eyes searching the paintings as though they might whisper the words Beckett never would. The air in the gallery hung heavy with silence, Beckett's absence still lingering like smoke that refused to disperse. Peggy walked among her canvases, hearing again the echo of his voice, the way he spoke of futility and longing, the way he left her both full and empty. Yet silence cannot last forever. Into the quiet came another figure, louder, brighter, a presence that swept aside stillness with flamboyance. His name was Max Ernst. Ernst was already known in Paris as one of the wild visionaries of surrealism. German by birth, he carried the scars of war and the defiance of one who had chosen imagination as his battlefield. His works were dreamscapes of strange creatures, collages of impossible forms, visions both playful and unsettling. Where Beckett had been spare and austere, Ernst was exuberant, theatrical, his very presence demanding attention. He dressed with eccentricity, spoke with flourish, and drew people into his orbit with a force that was at once magnetic and dangerous. Peggy encountered him through the circles she had long drifted among, and at once she felt the pull. Ernst represented something entirely different from the cool withholding of Beckett or the violence of Lawrence. He was passionate, alive, and deeply entangled with the very art movements that fascinated her. To love him would mean not only intimacy but entry deeper into the surrealist world, and so, once more she yielded. Their relationship was tempestuous from the start. Ernst was already married when their affair began, a detail that did not deter either of them. Peggy, accustomed by now to scandal, cared little for propriety. What mattered was the intensity, the sense of being swept into a current stronger than herself. Ernst moved into her life as he moved into her collection, boldly, almost as if by right. Soon his paintings hung on her walls, his presence filled her rooms, his voice echoed in her gatherings. He became not only her lover, but her artist, a dual role that blurred the line between passion and patronage. In Ernst's company, Peggy discovered a new form of entanglement. Their love was creative as much as physical, entwined with the making of art itself. She supported his work, promoted his exhibitions, purchased his paintings, and in return, he gave her not only affection, but the thrill of proximity to genius. Yet the balance was precarious. Ernst was not faithful, nor did he pretend to be. His charm extended easily to others, and Peggy, who craved devotion, often found herself wounded by his wanderings. Jealousy gnawed at her, and quarrels erupted. Still, she endured, for the intensity of their connection outweighed the pain. There is something tragic, and perhaps inevitable in this pattern. Peggy sought from men the certainty she never found, and each time she met instead with absence, cruelty, or betrayal. Yet she could not resist the pull. With Ernst, the contradiction was stark. He gave her both the joy of artistic companionship and the torment of infidelity. Did she believe that to love an artist was to accept such wounds? Or did she believe that suffering proved the depth of passion? The answer remains hidden, unresolved, like so much of her life. Yet from this turbulent love, something lasting emerged. Ernst's presence deepened her engagement with surrealism, sharpening her eye, guiding her instincts. Through him, she gained entry into a circle of artists who would define the era. Salvador Dali, André Breton, Yves Tanguy, and others whose visions broke apart the boundaries of reason. Peggy collected their works not merely as possessions, but as fragments of a movement, pieces of a puzzle she felt compelled to assemble. In doing so, she began to build a collection that would one day outlive both her and her lovers. But even as she gathered canvases, history intervened. By the late 1930s, Europe trembled once more on the edge of catastrophe. Hitler's shadow lengthened across Germany, and the surrealists, many of them politically suspect or personally at risk, felt the danger closing in. Ernst, as a German and a radical, found himself especially vulnerable. The threat of war pressed upon their affair, turning passion into urgency. For Peggy, who had already lost her father to the sea and her marriage to violence, the thought of losing Ernst to the rising darkness was unbearable. She began to consider not only love, but rescue. As war approached, she moved decisively. She smuggled paintings, she secured visas, she used her fortune to protect what could be protected. Ernst himself was briefly imprisoned as an enemy alien in France, his fate uncertain. Peggy worked desperately to free him, to bring him across the ocean, to preserve both the man and the art that surrounded him. Love and patronage once again merged. Was she saving him as her lover, or as an artist, or both? Perhaps the distinction no longer mattered. Their eventual escape to America carried the air of both triumph and tragedy. Ernst was free. Peggy's collection was intact, and yet the turbulence between them continued. In New York, he remained restless, his eye wandering, his fidelity elusive. Peggy, who had risked so much for him, found herself again wounded. The cycle repeated as it always did. Yet she could not deny the role he had played in shaping her, nor the role she had played in preserving him. It is tempting to judge, to ask why she endured such pain, why she allowed herself to be hurt again and again. But perhaps the question is misguided. Peggy's life was not one of avoidance, but of immersion. She sought intensity, and intensity rarely arrives without wounds. To love Ernst was to live in fire, and though fire burns, it also illuminates. And so, as we leave this chapter, the images of Peggy and Ernst together in a small room, a half-finished canvas before him, Peggy watching with a mixture of admiration and longing. Outside, the world grows darker with war, but inside, the brush moves across the canvas, creating forms that defy reason, that speak of dreams even in nightmare times. Peggy watches, her heart both full and fractured, knowing already that love and art in her life could never be separated. The brush in Ernst's hand moved across the canvas, its strokes defying the logic of form, giving birth to strange creatures and dreamlike visions that belonged neither to waking life nor to sleep. Peggy watched him, her heart caught between admiration and ache, knowing already that his presence could never be hers alone. Yet even as she studied the colors taking shape, the sound outside their walls had changed. The low murmur of ordinary city life was now broken by marching boots, by radios heavy with speeches that grew sharper with each passing month. The rhythm of creation was being drowned by the drumbeat of war. By the late 1930s, the menace of fascism was no longer a shadow but a weight pressing daily upon Europe. Paris, once the sanctuary of artists and exiles, began to tremble with uncertainty. Friends whispered of arrests, of restrictions, of lists being drawn up. Galleries shuttered, cafes emptied, and the very streets that had once celebrated freedom grew cautious and silent. For Peggy, whose life had been defined by personal storms, this was the first time history itself swept directly into her path. She could not simply drift, nor could she retreat. She had to act. Ernst, as a German and as a surrealist, was especially vulnerable. Though opposed to the Nazis, he was nonetheless imprisoned in France as an enemy alien, his identity reduced to his nationality. Peggy fought desperately for his release, calling upon connections, spending money, moving from office to office with a determination that surprised even herself. To love Ernst was now also to rescue him, and to rescue him was to preserve the art he had yet to make. Was she driven by devotion to the man, or to the vision he carried? Perhaps the two had fused beyond separation, but it was not Ernst alone she sought to save. Her collection, fragile and precious, became another responsibility. Paintings by Miro, Dali, Brancusi, Kandinsky, and countless others hung in her care, many of them considered degenerate by the rising powers. To leave them behind was to risk their destruction. She began to gather them, one by one, packing them into crates, disguising them as ordinary possessions. Some works she bought hurriedly at low prices, taking advantage of a market collapsing under fear, though she herself saw it not as profiteering, but as rescue. She often said later that she was not collecting, but saving lives. For to her, these paintings carried souls, fragile as any human. In 1941, she managed to flee occupied France, smuggling Ernst and her collection across the Atlantic. The journey itself carried danger, the threat of interception at sea ever present. Perhaps she thought again of her father then, swallowed by the same waters decades earlier. Did she imagine him watching as she crossed, carrying not only her own fate, but the future of modern art in wooden crates? The ocean has always been both loss and passage in Peggy's life, and now it bore her once again from one world into another. New York awaited her with noise and energy, a city both alien and strangely familiar. Here she arrived not as an heiress or a drifting figure, but as a woman who had carried treasures across the ocean, who had risked everything to preserve visions others dismissed. She opened a new gallery in 1942, pointedly naming it Art of This Century. The name itself was a declaration. This was not about tradition or nostalgia, but about the present, about the urgent now. The gallery was unlike anything New York had seen. Designed with experimental displays, with canvases hung at odd angles, with lights and shadows arranged to create movement, it was less a gallery than an environment. Visitors walked not through silent halls, but through living spaces where art surrounded and unsettled them. Peggy had transformed her instinct into vision. She was not simply displaying works. She was declaring that art was alive, disruptive, necessary. Among the artists she championed, there was a young painter named Jackson Pollock, whose canvases seemed chaotic to most, filled with splatters and gestures that defied conventional form. To Peggy, they carried the same intensity she had once sought in lovers, the same refusal to conform. She bought his works, promoted him, gave him the support he needed to survive. In doing so, she helped shape not only his career, but the very course of American art, turning New York into a center of the avant-garde at a moment when Europe lay in ruins. Yet even in this triumph, her personal life faltered. Her relationship with Ernst, whom she had risked so much to save, grew strained. In New York, he was restless, unable to find his footing, his eye wandering to other women, his fidelity as elusive as ever. Peggy, wounded once more, realized that love could not be secured even through acts of rescue. They drifted apart, their entanglement ending with bitterness, leaving behind paintings, memories, and scars. But her gallery thrived, and in its survival, Peggy herself found a kind of survival. Surrounded by the work she had carried across the ocean, she created a new identity. Not the abandoned child, not the failed wife, not merely the lover of artists, but the collector, the champion, the Queen of Bohemian Art. She stood in her gallery as both host and guardian, offering the city not only paintings but the spirit of defiance they carried. Still, doubt never left her. She often wondered if she collected to serve art or to fill the absence within herself. Perhaps both. Yet what mattered, finally, was not the reason but the result. Masterpieces preserved, artists supported, a new movement born in a city that had once ignored modern art entirely. And so we leave her here, in the noise of wartime New York, her gallery alive with strange forms and unsettled visitors, her heart still restless, her future uncertain. Outside, the war rages on across the ocean she had crossed, but inside, the brushstrokes of Pollock, the visions of surrealists, the defiance of modernism all hang against the walls, whispering that even in times of destruction, creation endures. The walls of her gallery seem to breathe with strange life, the canvases whispering their own defiance against the destruction consuming the world across the ocean. Visitors entered warily, expecting another traditional exhibition, only to find themselves confronted with tilted walls, paintings hung at angles that defied balance, spotlights casting shadows that seemed to move, sculptures placed like sentinels in dim corners. Art of this century was not simply a gallery, it was an experience, one that unsettled and bewildered as much as it delighted. Peggy stood among the guests in her dark glasses, watching their reactions, half amused, half protective, as though she were both hostess and guardian of a secret flame. It was here that she encountered Jackson Pollock, a painter whose work at first seemed incomprehensible to many. His canvases were wild, filled not with delicate strokes but with gestures, splashes, drips, lines that crossed and tangled like the very chaos of life. To some, they looked like nothing at all, a mess of paint without form. But to Peggy, they vibrated with intensity. She sensed in them something raw, something that mirrored the turbulence she herself had known, the storms of marriage, the absence of love, the desperation of exile. Pollock's art did not soothe, it erupted. And that eruption, she believed, was precisely the truth of the moment. She took him under her protection, offering him a contract that allowed him to paint without fear of hunger. In return, he gave her works that challenged even her own endurance. To hang a Pollock in one's home was to invite disorder, to invite the refusal of calm. Yet Peggy embraced it. She said once that Pollock's art was like America itself, untamed and immense, a new language being born. Without her support, it is doubtful he would have survived those lean years. With it, he became a central figure of what would soon be called abstract expressionism, a movement that would shift the center of modern art from Paris to New York. Their relationship was not without tension. Pollock, like so many of the men Peggy loved and supported, was both brilliant and self-destructive. He drank heavily, he raged, he brooded in silence. He was often cruel, incapable of gratitude, lost in his own demons. Peggy endured as she had endured with others, seeing in him not only the wounds he inflicted, but the genius that flickered beneath. She believed in his work when few others did, and in that belief she gave him the chance to break through. The gallery became a gathering place, alive with energy. American artists, once dismissed as provincial imitators of Europe, now found themselves at the center of a new movement. Peggy's eye, instinctive and daring, brought them together. She championed not only Pollock, but Rothko, Motherwell, Calder, and many others whose names would later define the century. She did so not with the cold distance of an investor, but with the fierce intimacy of someone who felt their visions in her own flesh. Her gallery was less an institution than an extension of herself, her own hunger for meaning expressed through the works she chose to shelter. And yet, as always, her personal life remained unsettled. Lovers drifted through her orbit, affairs began and ended, each leaving traces but never permanence. She was often accused of confusing love with patronage, of blurring the lines between desire and support. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she could not help it. To Peggy, art and love were never separate. Both were acts of surrender. Both carried risk. Both left scars. She gave herself to men as she gave herself to canvases, fully, recklessly, demanding in return not perfection, but intensity. Her relationship with Pollock in particular carried this ambiguity. She admired him, supported him, desired him at times, but she also feared him. His volatility reminded her of Lawrence, his silences of Beckett, his betrayals of Ernst. Yet unlike them, Pollock's art was inseparable from his turmoil. To abandon him would have been to abandon a vision she knew the world needed, and so she stayed, enduring his moods, his outbursts, his descent into alcoholism, because she saw in his canvases the future of art. Was this devotion, or was it compulsion? Perhaps the two were indistinguishable in Peggy's life. As the war drew to a close, Peggy's gallery stood as a beacon of something new. Europe lay in ruins, its museums damaged, its artists scattered. But in New York, a new center of gravity emerged, one that would shape the decades to come. Peggy's role in this shift cannot be overstated. She brought with her the visions of Europe, preserved from destruction, and she nurtured the wild new voices of America. She was the bridge, the conduit, the one who carried the flame across the ocean and kept it alive until it could ignite again. Yet even in triumph, she remained restless. Success did not soothe her loneliness, nor did it erase the ache of failed loves. She walked among her galleries with dark glasses, not only to protect her eyes, but perhaps also to shield her from the gaze of others, from the vulnerability of being truly seen. Her laughter at openings was often genuine, but it was also a mask, a way of keeping the emptiness at bay. The smell of turpentine lingered in her memory, mingling with the sound of Pollock's brushes hitting canvas, the splatter of paint striking floor. It was a sound she never forgot, for it embodied both creation and chaos, both promise and ruin. To watch Pollock paint was to watch a man wrestle with his own demons, each gesture a battle, each canvas a field of struggle. Peggy stood at the edge of that struggle, both witness and enabler, knowing she could not save him, but determined at least to preserve what he made. And so, as we close this chapter, the image is of Peggy standing in her gallery late at night after all guests have left. The lights are dim, the canvases loom around her, and in the center hangs a Pollock, dripping with movement, alive with gesture. She stands before it, silent, as though listening for something within its splatters, something that might answer the questions that lovers never could. Outside, the city hums, but inside, only the painting speaks, whispering of beauty born from chaos, of survival born from destruction. The canvas dripped with paint, as if time itself had been captured in motion, frozen mid-fall, yet alive with its own restless energy. Peggy stood before it, her dark glasses reflecting back the chaos, her body still as though afraid to break the spell. The room around her was silent now, emptied of guests, emptied of chatter. But in the silence she felt the echo of all those voices that filled her days. Artists, lovers, critics, friends, each pulling at her in different ways, each demanding something of her. To stand alone before Pollock's painting was to feel for a moment a kind of truth, that art asked nothing but to exist. Men, by contrast, asked for everything. It was in this fragile space between patronage and passion that Peggy often lost her balance. She gave money, she gave encouragement, she opened doors, and in return she asked for closeness, for affection, for love. But to intertwine, the two was always dangerous. Artists often took what she offered without hesitation, yet they rarely gave back the devotion she craved. Was this her mistake, to confuse generosity with intimacy? Or was it their mistake, to accept her gifts without seeing the heart behind them? The answer was never clear, and perhaps it never could be. In New York, her gallery became more than a space for paintings. It became a theater where the dramas of art and desire played out in equal measure. Openings were smoky, crowded, filled with men and women who argued fiercely about the meaning of abstraction, who drank heavily, who drifted into corners where whispers grew into affairs. Peggy was both hostess and participant, drifting from group to group, her glasses hiding her exhaustion, her laughter disguising her doubt. She was adored, envied, ridiculed, and needed all at once. Her relationships with artists grew complicated. Some she supported purely from conviction, believing in their work without seeking anything more. Others became her lovers, and with them the boundaries blurred. Was she drawn to them because of their genius, or did she see genius because she was drawn? Did they love her for herself, or for what she could provide? The questions gnawed at her, yet she rarely allowed them to stop her. Better to give and be wounded, she thought, than to withhold and be empty. There were nights when she felt herself at the center of a great movement, when the room vibrated with possibility, when she knew she had helped midwife something new into the world. And there were nights when she returned home alone, her body weary, her spirit hollow, asking herself whether any of it mattered, whether the paintings on her walls would outlast the loneliness in her heart. Her gallery demanded everything of her. The financial strain was immense, the critics often hostile, the public slow to understand. Yet she pressed on, for to abandon it would have been to abandon herself. The artists needed her, and she needed them, though the exchange was never equal. She once admitted that she gave too much, that she had never learned the art of moderation, in love or in life. Perhaps it was true. Her generosity was boundless, but it was also a plea, a way of asking to be seen. Pollock himself embodied this paradox. She believed in him more fiercely than most, and yet his ingratitude stung deeply. He drank, he raged, he disappeared, leaving Peggy to defend him to critics who dismissed his canvases as childish. She continued to buy his works, to exhibit him, to speak of his genius, even as he wounded her with indifference. In supporting him, she seemed to reenact a familiar pattern, giving everything to a man who could never return her devotion. But she also knew that without her he might vanish, his art lost to poverty and self-destruction. In preserving him, she preserved something larger than either of them. The gossip of New York followed her closely. Some whispered that her collection was only the extension of her bed, that her patronage was seduction in disguise. Others accused her of vulgarity, of mixing money and flesh without shame. Peggy did not deny the charges, nor did she confirm them. She lived openly, refusing to hide her lovers, refusing to apologize for her choices. Scandal was a cloak she wore as comfortably as her dark glasses. If they mocked her, so be it. She had long since learned that respectability was a prison, and she preferred the freedom of disapproval to the chains of convention. And yet, in quieter moments, she admitted to herself that scandal was a lonely crown. To be known as the Queen of Bohemian Art was to be celebrated for defiance, but rarely for tenderness. Did anyone truly see her? Did anyone truly love her, apart from her fortune and her daring? The thought returned to her often, like the echo of her father's absence, like the silence Beckett left behind, like the betrayals Ernst had carved into her. Each man left his mark, and in each mark she found herself turning more deeply toward the canvases that never betrayed her. Still, she continued. She could not stop. To collect was no longer pastime but compulsion, as natural as breathing. Each acquisition felt like a gesture against despair, proof that beauty could survive even when love failed. The gallery grew, her reputation spread, and slowly even the critics began to acknowledge that she had been right. Abstract expressionism was no passing fancy. It was the new language of art. New York, once provincial, had become the center of the avant-garde, and Peggy had helped bring it there. But triumph never silenced her doubts. She walked each night through her rooms, her dogs at her heels, pausing before the canvases as though seeking answers in their silence. Did they love her? These works she had saved? Could they love her as men could not? The question lingered, unresolved, like the faint scent of turpentine that clung to the air long after the painters had gone. And so we end this chapter with the image of Peggy closing the doors of her gallery after another crowded evening, the sound of glasses still clinking faintly in the distance. She removes her glasses for a moment, rubs her tired eyes, and turns once more to the canvases, the only companions who have never abandoned her. Outside, the city roars with life, but inside, she listens only to the silent voices of her collection, wondering if they are enough. The canvases in her gallery kept their silence, patient companions in the hours after the guests had gone. Peggy lingered there often, unwilling to step out into the night, as though the paintings themselves offered the only true company. Yet when she did leave, when she stepped once more into the smoke-filled streets of wartime New York, she entered a different kind of gathering, one less formal but no less vital. The community of exiles who had drifted across the Atlantic like scattered leaves, carried from the storm of Europe into a strange, bustling refuge. These were men and women who had lost homelands, who carried with them languages that now sounded foreign in the ears of strangers, who arrived with little but a few manuscripts, a handful of canvases, or the habits of their imagination. Surrealists, poets, philosophers, painters. They crowded into cramped apartments, smoky cafes, borrowed studios. Their bodies were displaced, but their minds refused to yield. Peggy, with her fortune and her instinct, became a center for them. Her home and her gallery were not only spaces for art, but havens for those who had nowhere else to turn. The gatherings were intense, filled with arguments in many tongues, cigarettes burned down to their ends, glasses of cheap wine emptied quickly. André Breton, the surrealist leader, declaimed on the purity of his movement with the fervor of a prophet, while others rolled their eyes. Marcel Duchamp, sly and ironic, moved easily between conversations, never revealing the full extent of his own opinions. Salvador Dalí appeared, flamboyant and theatrical, his mustache as sharp as his tongue, captivating some, repelling others. Peggy sat among them, listening, laughing, sometimes intervening, sometimes watching quietly from the edge. She was not one of them by birth or by craft, but she had become essential nonetheless. With her money, she paid rents, arranged exhibitions, purchased works. With her presence, she gave legitimacy, her Guggenheim name opening doors otherwise closed. Yet beyond money and influence, she gave something more, a recognition that exile did not have to mean invisibility. She believed in them, even when the world dismissed them as irrelevant or incomprehensible, and they, in turn, gave her a kind of belonging she had long craved. For in their displacement, in their sense of never quite fitting, Peggy recognized her own reflection. She, too, had always felt outside the circles she entered, unloved as a child, restless as a wife, half-welcomed as a patron. Among the exiles, she found not a nation but a tribe, bound not by geography but by refusal to conform, refusal to surrender, refusal to silence their visions. The conversations flowed late into the night. They spoke of Europe, of the loss of home, of the fear for those still trapped. They spoke of art as a form of survival, as proof that imagination could not be conquered even by armies. Peggy absorbed it all, sometimes joining, sometimes simply letting the voices wash over her like music. She often confessed that she felt most alive in these moments, when the air was thick with ideas, when laughter and despair mingled freely, yet as always, the personal and the artistic entwined. Lovers drifted through her circle. Affairs began in whispers, ended in bitterness. She moved from one embrace to another, searching for the devotion she could never quite hold. The exiles themselves, wounded and unstable, often offered passion but rarely security. Still, She yielded, because to be close, even briefly, was better than the echo of absence. And in the morning, when the lovers had gone, the canvases remained. Her collection grew, even as war continued overseas. She acquired works with the urgency of one who knew that time was fragile, that what was not saved today might be lost forever tomorrow. Some criticized her methods, accusing her of taking advantage of desperate artists, of buying cheaply what would later be priceless. But Peggy always insisted she was preserving, not exploiting. Without her, these works might have vanished entirely, destroyed in the chaos of occupation and exile. She became, in her own way, an archivist of survival. In this, she also redefined herself. She was no longer merely an heiress dabbling in Bohemia, nor simply a patron lending her fortune to fashionable causes. She was becoming the custodian of a generation's vision, the one who ensured that the voices of exiles, fragmented though they were, would not fade into silence. It gave her life a shape, even as her heart remained restless. And yet, even here, doubt followed her. Did they see her as one of them, or only as the woman with money? Did they love her company, or merely tolerate it for the sake of survival? She asked herself these questions often, staring into the smoke at midnight, watching the faces of men who argued fiercely one moment and embraced her the next. She did not know the answers. Perhaps she never would. Still, the gatherings continued. The voices grew louder, the laughter rose. The poems were read aloud. The canvases painted in cramped rooms carried into her gallery for light and space. Out of displacement, a strange homeland was formed, one not of land or borders, but of imagination. And Peggy, with her glasses and her dogs and her restless generosity, became its unlikely queen. As the war drew toward its close, this circle of exiles began to disperse. Some returned to Europe, others remained in America, still others faded into obscurity. But their mark had been made, and Peggy had been at the center of it. She had given them shelter, and they had given her a sense of belonging, however fragile, however fleeting. And so we end this chapter with the image of Peggy sitting in her gallery after one of these long nights, the air still thick with smoke, glasses half drained on tables, chairs left askew. The voices have faded, the exiles have gone to their borrowed rooms, and she remains, staring at the paintings they left behind. In their silence, she hears still the echoes of their laughter and their grief, and for a moment, she feels less alone. The smoke still hung in the gallery after the exiles had gone, curling in thin threads that drifted upward and dissolved into the dim ceiling. Peggy sat among the emptied glasses and scattered chairs, her dark lenses catching the faint light of street lamps outside. She could almost still hear them, Breton's commanding tone, Duchamp's quiet laughter, Dali's theatrical pronouncements, as though the walls themselves held their voices in suspension. Yet silence was returning, and with it the question of what came next. For even as New York had given her purpose and the artists had given her belonging, she felt the call of another shore. The war was ending, Europe was reopening, and the continent that had once expelled its dreamers now waited in ruins for those who would dare to return. Peggy was among the first. She had preserved her collection through chaos, smuggled it across an ocean, defended it in a skeptical city, and now she longed to bring it back to the landscapes that had given it birth. But it was not only the art that pulled her across the Atlantic, it was also her own restlessness. New York had been necessary, even triumphant, but she never felt it as home. Its energy was harsh, its rhythms too fast, its eyes too critical. Europe, for all its instability, held the melancholy she understood, the weight of history pressing close, the possibility of beauty rising again from destruction. She returned in 1947, her collection intact, her reputation stronger, but her heart still unsettled. She wandered first through familiar cities, Paris, London, yet neither offered her what she sought. Paris was changed, wounded, shadows of occupation lingering in its boulevards. London was stern, recovering, but to Peggy it felt heavy with restraint. It was in Italy, in Venice, that she found what she did not know she had been searching for. Venice, with its canals shimmering like liquid mirrors, its decaying palaces, its silence broken only by the cry of gulls and the splash of oars, seemed a place both alive and suspended in time. The city carried beauty and melancholy intertwined, its very stones whispering of former grandeur, its waters reflecting both light and ruin. Peggy felt at once kinship and consolation. Here was a city that had endured loss, yet remained beautiful, that had been wounded by centuries, and yet still glimmered with dignity. It was, in some deep way, her own reflection. She purchased the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, an unfinished 18th-century palace on the Grand Canal, its façade bare, its story incomplete. The choice was telling. Peggy had no desire for a perfect palace. She wanted instead a place that carried incompletion, a home that echoed her own sense of being unfinished. The palazzo became not only her dwelling, but her stage, its rooms soon filled with the work she had gathered over decades, each canvas a memory, each sculpture a witness. She hung them not in careful order, but in the rhythms of her own instinct, creating a space that was less museum than living body. Visitors who entered often found themselves disoriented. Masterpieces of Kandinsky, Ernst, Brancusi, Pollock, Giacometti, all hung not with solemn labels, but in intimate proximity, as though they were companions in conversation rather than artifacts to be revered. Peggy walked among them daily, her dogs trotting at her heels, her glasses shielding her eyes, her presence at once eccentric and regal. She had become, in Venice, something like a living legend, though she carried her legend with a shrug, refusing the solemnity of institutions, even as she built one of her own. The city embraced her in its own ambiguous way. To Venetians, she was both outsider and fixture, a foreign woman whose palazzo hosted the strangest of gatherings, whose gondola often carried dogs rather than dignitaries, whose wit could sting as easily as it could charm. To artists, she was indispensable, a patron whose support had saved careers, whose taste had shaped movements. To herself, she remained simply Peggy, still restless, still longing, still unsure whether art could fill the emptiness left by absence. In 1948, she agreed to show her collection at the Venice Biennale. It was the first time the modern masters she had gathered, Picasso, Ernst, Pollock, Miro, were displayed together in Europe after the war. The response was electric. Some were outraged, calling the works ugly, scandalous, incomprehensible. Others were exhilarated, recognizing that a new language of art had arrived on European soil. For Peggy, standing among the murmurs, it was a moment of vindication. She had risked everything to preserve these works, and now they stood in the light, undeniable. Yet even triumph did not erase solitude. At night, the palazzo grew quiet, the waters of the canal lapping against its stones. Peggy walked the marble floors with her dogs, the paintings staring silently from the walls. She felt herself queen of a kingdom that was both real and fragile, a realm of color and form that could not embrace her in return. She invited guests. She filled the rooms with laughter, but she knew that when the doors closed, she was alone. Her daughter, Peggy, sometimes visited, and their relationship was fraught with distance, with unspoken grievances. Peggy, who had longed so deeply for love, had struggled to give it freely as a mother. Peggy carried her own wounds, her own restlessness, her own need for escape. Their bond was marked less by tenderness than by tension, and Peggy, for all her wit and power, never found the words to heal it. In the midst of her collection, among the countless canvases she had saved, this one relationship seemed beyond rescue. Still, Venice gave Peggy what no other place had, a stage where she could at last settle, however uneasily. The palazzo became her world, each room a memory, each painting a confession. She drifted through its halls like a figure in her own surrealist tableau, half real, half legend. Visitors came and went, critics praised and condemned, but the city itself remained, its waters reflecting her story as faithfully as its palazzo walls displayed her art. And so we close this chapter with the image of Peggy standing on her terrace at dusk, the sky fading into violet, the canal glowing faintly in the last light. Gondolas pass, their oars dipping softly into the water, leaving ripples that shimmer and fade. Behind her, the palazzo holds her collection, silent and eternal. Before her, the city stretches into shadow and reflection. Peggy lingers there, caught between the weight of what she has preserved and the emptiness of what she has lost. A woman at once crowned and solitary, queen of a kingdom only she could have built. The violet sky over Venice faded into night, and Peggy lingered on her terrace, her dogs clustered at her feet, their small bodies warm against the cool marble. She gazed at the canal where gondolas passed like shadows, their voices carrying faintly across the water. Behind her, her palazzo was filled with paintings that bore witness to her choices. Yet before her was only the stillness of evening, broken by the lap of waves. To the city, she was already becoming a figure of legend. The woman with dark glasses, the woman with the dogs, the woman whose walls glimmered with strange, unsettling art. Her image was inseparable from her reality. She wore her dark glasses not only against the sun but against the world, as though shielding her eyes from too much scrutiny, as though allowing herself to see without being seen. The glasses became a mask, one she rarely removed, and in time they came to symbolize her, eccentric, mysterious, untouchable. Her dogs, too, became part of the legend, always trotting beside her, small guardians of her solitude. She often said that animals loved her more faithfully than men ever had, and in their constant presence, she found a loyalty that required no bargaining. Visitors to the palazzo often recalled not only the paintings, but the sight of Peggy surrounded by her dogs, their nails clicking softly on the marble floors, their eyes watchful as if they too were curators of the collection. She cultivated her eccentricity, but not as affectation. It was, rather, her defense, her way of inhabiting a world that had so often wounded her. Eccentricity gave her freedom. In embracing strangeness, she no longer had to seek approval. She could laugh at propriety, dismiss convention, live according to her own desires. It was an armor woven of oddities, glasses, dogs, sharp wit, unpredictable gestures, and behind it she protected the vulnerability she rarely confessed. Her wit was infamous. She could cut with a single phrase, leaving critics and admirers alike unsettled. She mocked the pomp of institutions, the arrogance of men who dismissed the art she cherished. Yet her sharpness was also a shield. By laughing at others, she could keep them from seeing her own doubt. By striking first, she could prevent being wounded. The role of eccentric patron, scandalous and witty, became her stage costume, and she wore it with the confidence of one who knew that behind the performance lay fragility. Visitors to the palazzo encountered not a solemn museum, but a world alive with contradictions. Peggy greeted them with laughter and irreverence, sometimes guiding them through her collection, sometimes leaving them to wander as her dogs followed at their heels. She placed works side by side according to her own instincts, not by chronology or school. She wanted people to feel the energy of art, not the weight of scholarship. Some were scandalized, others exhilarated, but none left indifferent. And always, Peggy was there, glasses hiding her eyes, her small frame dwarfed by the canvases she had preserved, her presence as much a part of the collection as the art itself. Eccentricity extended beyond her home. She was seen in Venice drifting through the streets, her gondola carrying her and her dogs, like royalty of another realm. She dressed with little regard for fashion, mixing elegance with oddity, as though to remind the world that she had no interest in conformity. To some, she was a curiosity, a wealthy woman indulging her whims. To others, she was a symbol of defiance, living proof that one could construct identity outside the boundaries of society. For herself, she was simply Peggy, lonely at times, proud at others, always restless. Her reputation spread. Tourists whispered of her palazzo, critics gossiped about her lovers, artists recalled her generosity and her sharpness. She was both adored and mocked, yet she seemed immune to both extremes. If they ridiculed her, she laughed with them. If they praised her, she dismissed it with irony. Praise and ridicule alike rolled off the armor of eccentricity she had built. What mattered was not what they said of her, but that she had built a kingdom of art that no one could ignore. And yet, in the privacy of her rooms, eccentricity dissolved, and Peggy was simply herself, a woman aging, a mother estranged from her daughter, a soul still carrying the absence of her father, the betrayals of lovers, the doubts of belonging. Her dogs comforted her, her paintings surrounded her, but the quiet hours reminded her that eccentricity was not the same as intimacy. She confessed at times to friends that she feared being forgotten, that her collection might one day outshine her, that she herself might vanish into the legend she had created. Still, she leaned into the legend. It gave her strength, and it gave her visibility. If she was to be remembered, let it be as the Queen of Bohemian Art, the woman in dark glasses with dogs at her heels, the woman who saved paintings others would have abandoned. Better to be remembered as strange than to be forgotten as ordinary. The city of Venice accepted her on these terms. She became part of its tapestry, as familiar as the gondoliers, as enigmatic as the crumbling palaces. Children pointed at her gondola. Tourists whispered when they glimpsed her. Artists sought her support. Critics sharpened their pens. And Peggy, behind her glasses, behind her wit, behind her dogs, continued to walk the marble floors of her palazzo as though she owned not only the collection within, but the city itself. And so we close this chapter with the image of Peggy seated in the great hall of her palazzo. Her dogs sprawled across her lap and at her feet, the paintings rising high behind her. A visitor asks a question about her life, her loves, her choices, and Peggy responds with a laugh, a sharp remark that deflects the inquiry. The visitor leaves, puzzled, amused, uncertain. Peggy remains, her laughter fading into the quiet, her glasses reflecting the dim light of the canal. The dogs shift against her, loyal and silent. Behind her, the art waits, speaking truths she will never reveal aloud. The visitor's laughter still echoed faintly in the great hall, fading into silence as the door closed, and Peggy remained with her dogs and her paintings. She leaned back in her chair, her glasses catching the dim glow of the canal light, and for a moment she seemed every inch the queen of her eccentric kingdom. Yet behind the armor of wit and spectacle lay a wound that no gallery, no collection, no parade of artists could mend. For amid the hundreds of canvases she had preserved, one life had slipped from her care, the life of her daughter, Peggy. Peggy was the only child of Peggy's first marriage to Lawrence Vail, and perhaps from the beginning their bond carried the fracture of that union. Peggy, restless and wounded, struggled to inhabit the role of mother with the same intensity she gave to her lovers or to her collection. She loved her daughter, but love is not always expressed in the language a child needs. Peggy grew up in the shadow of absence, sensing the distance that had shaped Peggy herself in childhood. What Peggy had longed for from her own mother, tenderness, constancy, she found difficult to give in return. And yet, Peggy was her mother's child in other ways. She was restless, sensitive, marked by a hunger for recognition. She too turned toward art, not as collector but as painter, creating canvases filled with delicate figures and tender melancholy. There was beauty in her work, but also fragility, as though each brushstroke trembled with uncertainty. Peggy, who had so often supported the bold and defiant, found herself perplexed by her daughter's quiet sadness. She supported her financially, hung some of her works, even praised her at times, but there was always an undercurrent of strain. Was Peggy envious of her daughter's creativity, or simply unable to reconcile her maternal role with her role as patron? The line was blurred, and in that blur, Peggy felt abandoned. The years passed, and Pagin's struggles deepened. She married, divorced, remarried, seeking in others the devotion she had never felt secure in receiving at home. Her relationships were turbulent, her heart fragile, her body frail. Depression haunted her, the same darkness that had always trailed her mother in quieter hours. Yet where Peggy had found a form of survival in collecting, Peggy had only her painting, and it was not enough. In 1967, Peggy died of an overdose of barbiturates. Whether accident or intention, the question was never fully resolved. What remained was the fact. Peggy's only daughter, lost in her 40s, her body unable to carry the weight of despair. For Peggy, the blow was devastating, though she rarely spoke of it. She had known loss before. Her father to the sea, her lovers to betrayal, her homeland to disillusion. But this loss carried a different weight. A child's death leaves a silence that no art, however brilliant, can fill. In later years, visitors noticed that Peggy avoided speaking of Peggy. When asked, she would deflect, sometimes with wit, sometimes with silence. Yet in private moments, her grief was unmistakable. She had saved hundreds of paintings, preserved the works of artists across continents and wars, yet she had been unable to save her daughter. The irony was cruel, and Peggy bore it with the same armor she wore against every wound. Eccentricity, spectacle, wit. But behind the mask, the wound remained open. Some of Peggy's works remained in the collection, hanging quietly among the more famous canvases. Visitors often overlooked them, drawn instead to the bold gestures of Pollock, the strange visions of Ernst, the sharp geometries of Kandinsky. Yet for Peggy, those delicate paintings must have whispered differently. They carried not only Peggy's vision, but also the shadow of her absence, a reminder of what had been lost, of what could not be preserved. To walk past those canvases each day was to be haunted, gently but relentlessly, by the failure of love. Perhaps this was why Peggy's eccentricities deepened in her later years. Her glasses grew darker, her wit sharper, her reliance on her dogs more visible. She seemed to cloak herself ever more fully in performance, as though the public role of scandalous queen could shield her from the private reality of grief. People laughed at her quirks, admired her defiance, repeated her sharp remarks as though they were treasures. Few looked closely enough to see the sorrow that fueled them, for even in grief, Peggy remained restless. She continued to host visitors, to guide them through her palazzo, to insist on the vitality of her collection. The art became her language of survival once again. If she could not preserve her daughter, she could at least preserve the visions of others, ensuring that beauty, however fractured, endured beyond loss. She once remarked that she lived in and through her collection, and perhaps this was truer after Peggy's death than ever before. But solitude pressed closer. Her circle of lovers had long since faded. Many of her artist friends were gone, and her family remained distant, suspicious of her choices, critical of her scandals. She had her dogs, loyal until their last breath, and she had her art, silent but steadfast. Yet the absence of her daughter remained, a hollow space in her palazzo, an echo louder than laughter. And so we end this chapter with the image of Peggy standing alone before one of Pegin's paintings in a quiet corner of her home. The visitors have passed by without comment, drawn to brighter names, but Peggy pauses, her dogs clustered around her, her glasses hiding her eyes. She does not speak. The painting stares back, delicate and unresolved, carrying within its lines both tenderness and despair. Peggy turns away at last, her footsteps soft against the marble, her silence heavier than her wit could ever disguise. The silence before Pegin's fragile painting lingered in the halls of the palazzo, a silence Peggy carried within her even as she turned back toward the rooms where the louder canvases lived. She knew grief was not something to be displayed. It was not part of the legend, not something for visitors to admire. Instead, she shifted her body toward the living pulse of her collection, the bright, unruly voices of Pollock, Ernst, Miro, Brancusi, Kandinsky, and so many others who clamored for recognition. Their works were not silent, but insistent, demanding to be seen, demanding to be argued over. Peggy, restless as always, found herself leaning again toward the world of spectacle, toward the stage where scandal and art often mingled. That stage, in 1948, was the Venice Biennale. The Biennale had long been a place for nations to parade their culture, a festival of prestige where pavilions showcased the approved voices of tradition. After the devastation of war, it took on new urgency. Europe sought to reassert its identity, to claim continuity even through ruin. For Peggy, recently returned from America, the Biennale offered a chance to bring her rescued collection into the light of Europe once more. She agreed to exhibit a portion of her works not as a national display, but as a personal one, the legacy of a single woman who had defied convention to preserve what others dismissed. When the doors opened, the effect was electric. Visitors who had come expecting the safety of landscapes and portraits found themselves confronted instead by the fractured geometries of cubism, the dreamscapes of surrealism, the violent gestures of early abstract expressionism. For many, it was a shock. Some recoiled, muttering of obscenity, of madness, of the corruption of taste. Others leaned forward in fascination, recognizing that this was not simply art but the sound of a new world being born. Peggy stood among them, her glasses glinting, her small dogs weaving through the crowd, amused at the outrage, satisfied by the bewilderment. Scandal and triumph came together, as they always seemed to in her life. Newspapers debated whether she had disgraced the Biennale or revitalized it. Critics argued loudly in cafes, some praising her courage, others dismissing her as a vulgarian meddling in affairs beyond her understanding. Peggy, who had long since grown immune to the opinions of others, laughed at it all. She once quipped that if people were not shocked, then the art had failed. For her, outrage was proof of vitality, and scandal was simply another form of acknowledgement. Yet beneath her laughter was the weight of vindication. For years, she had been ridiculed in London and New York, her choices dismissed as eccentric, her collections sneered at as a whim. Now, in the heart of Europe, she saw crowds gathering before works she had risked so much to preserve, their voices rising in admiration as often as in scorn. She had carried these canvases through war, hidden them in crates, smuggled them across seas, defended them against mockery, and here they stood, undeniable. Whatever the critics said, she knew the works had survived, and survival was itself a triumph. The Biennale also placed her firmly in the public eye. The woman in dark glasses, with her odd manner and her defiant collection, became a subject of fascination. Tourists whispered her name, artists sought her favor, society gossiped about her lovers and her eccentricities. Peggy accepted it with her usual mixture of amusement and detachment. If they wished to talk, let them talk. The paintings mattered more. Still, she enjoyed the attention, for even ridicule was preferable to invisibility, and she had lived too long feeling unseen. The Venice Biennale marked a turning point. From that moment, her palazzo was no longer merely her home. It was a destination, a place of pilgrimage for those who wished to see the strange and scandalous collection of Peggy Guggenheim. Visitors arrived by gondola, stepping into the unfinished palace where modern art hung not as relics, but as living companions. They marveled, they mocked, they whispered, they argued, but they came. Peggy had made herself, through her collection, unavoidable, and yet, as always, triumph carried its shadow. Behind the spectacle, Peggy remained the woman who paused before her daughter's paintings in silence. She knew better than anyone that scandal and acclaim alike were fragile, that applause faded quickly, that beneath all the noise was the same longing she had carried since childhood, the longing to be loved without condition. The Biennale gave her recognition, but it did not give her solace. Still, she leaned into the triumph. Venice, with its water and silence, had become her stage, and the Biennale had crowned her queen of a kingdom built not of nations, but of visions. She continued to expand her collection, to welcome visitors, to laugh at the scorn of critics, and to savor the admiration of those who saw what she had seen. She allowed herself, if only briefly, to believe that her life of losses had been transformed into a life of preservation, that her wounds had given birth to a legacy larger than herself. And so we end this chapter with the image of Peggy walking slowly through the Biennale halls, her glasses catching the light, her dogs trotting faithfully at her side. Around her the crowd murmurs, some in awe, some in outrage, some in confusion. The paintings stare back, bold and unapologetic. Peggy pauses, amused, perhaps even proud, for in this moment scandal and triumph are one and the same, and she knows she has done what few could. She has turned her chaos into something that cannot be ignored. The murmurs of the Biennale still drifted in Peggy's ears long after the exhibition halls had emptied, half in admiration, half in outrage. She carried those echoes back to her palazzo, where the works now hung with a new aura, no longer only her private companions, but acknowledged actors on the world stage. The triumph was real, the scandal expected, and yet when the applause faded into memory, Peggy found herself once more facing the more intimate stage of her own life, where the years had begun to show their weight. She was in her 50s then, her hair streaked with gray, her body no longer carrying the bloom of youth. The world still whispered of her lovers, still speculated about her eccentric affairs. But for Peggy herself, the experience of passion had begun to shift. She had once thrown herself into love with reckless abandon, seeking salvation in the arms of men who rarely offered it. Now, though the hunger for intimacy remained, it was complicated by the knowledge of her own aging. She was no longer the restless heiress in Paris cafes, nor the daring patron chasing surrealists through Montparnasse, nor even the eccentric hostess of wartime New York. She was Peggy of Venice, already a legend, yet privately uncertain how to reconcile her fading beauty with her undiminished need to be desired. Still, she pursued passion. Younger men drifted through her life, drawn perhaps by her fortune, perhaps by her legend, perhaps by her eccentric magnetism. She welcomed them, even as she recognized the imbalance. To some, she was benefactor, to others, a conquest, to a few, a fleeting affection. She laughed at the scandal such affairs provoked, but behind the laughter lingered doubt. Did they come for her, or for her name, or for her collection? Did it matter? She confessed at times that she could not resist the thrill of desire, even when it left her wounded. Better to risk humiliation than to surrender to solitude. Her body aged, but her appetite for life did not. She still attended gatherings, still offered sharp remarks, still filled her rooms with noise and energy. Visitors often remarked that she seemed timeless, that her eccentricity made her ageless. Yet Peggy herself was acutely aware of time. Each morning the mirror reminded her of lines deepening, of skin loosening, of vitality slowly retreating. She masked it with her glasses, with her wit, with her dogs, but within herself she felt the erosion. This too became part of her armor. She joked about her age, mocked herself before others could, transformed fragility into spectacle. Eccentricity remained her shield. And yet in quieter moments she confessed her fear of being unloved. Fame, scandal, recognition, all of it paled before the simple question, who would remain beside her when the noise was gone? Lovers drifted in and out like tides. Critics wrote their sharp lines and moved on. Visitors passed through the palazzo, marveling at the art, but barely glimpsing the woman. The paintings endured, but endurance was not the same as affection. Peggy, even crowned with triumph, remained lonely. Still, she clung to passion, even if it came in brief fragments. Affairs continued, some playful, some serious, none lasting. She was accused of vulgarity, of desperation, of clinging to youth through her lovers. She did not deny it. She had long since ceased to care for respectability. If she shocked, she shocked. If she scandalized, she scandalized. Better to be alive in rumor than to fade quietly into obscurity. Her collection, meanwhile, grew into permanence. The Biennale had established her as a force in modern art, and Venice itself became synonymous with her name. Artists visited, critics returned, tourists came in increasing numbers to glimpse the woman in the unfinished palace on the canal. Peggy relished the attention, but she also feared being consumed by it. Would people remember her as a woman, or only as the eccentric owner of paintings? Would her life itself vanish behind the legend of her collection? She fought against this by weaving herself into the story of her art. She insisted on her role, reminded others of the risks she had taken, the artists she had discovered, the movements she had defended when no one else dared. She made herself inseparable from the collection, so that to speak of the art was also to speak of her. It was both vanity and survival, for Peggy understood that memory is fragile, and only by binding her life to her art could she hope to be remembered. The aging body, however, remained a truth no wit could erase. She confessed at times, half joking, half serious, that she feared becoming invisible as a woman even while she grew ever more visible as a legend. The paradox cut deep. She wanted passion, intimacy, affection, but the mirror reminded her daily that the world no longer saw her with the same eyes. And so she leaned ever more heavily on her art, her dogs, her eccentricity, turning each into a companion that did not abandon her. Yet even in her later years, Peggy never surrendered to bitterness. She continued to laugh, to love, to scandalize, to shock. Visitors recalled her sharp tongue, her irreverence, her refusal to take herself or others too seriously. She might speak of her lovers with both pride and mockery, dismissing their betrayals with a shrug, recounting her scandals as though they were anecdotes in a play. Behind the performance was pain, yes, but also resilience. Peggy had been wounded countless times, but she refused to be broken. And so we end this chapter with the image of Peggy in her 60s, seated in her palazzo with a glass of wine in hand, her dog sprawled across her lap, her dark glasses hiding her eyes. Around her hang the paintings she had preserved, each one a fragment of her life. She lifts the glass in a private toast, perhaps to herself, perhaps to her lovers, perhaps to the ghosts who still linger in her memory. Outside, the water of the canal ripples softly in the moonlight. Inside, Peggy remains, aging, restless, eccentric, and still, in her own way, alive with passion. The glass of wine lingered in her hand, its surface catching the shimmer of moonlight from the canal beyond. Peggy raised it with a wry smile, as though toasting her ghosts, her lovers, her absent father, her lost daughter, the vanished nights of Paris and New York. Yet even as she drank, she knew the world beyond her palazzo was already beginning to measure her life, not in laughter or in wounds, but in judgment. For as she grew older, her collection grew ever more valuable, and with it came disputes, envy, and questions about who Peggy Guggenheim really was, visionary or vulgarian, savior of art or scandalous heiress, squandering her fortune on whims. Her family in America, the other branches of the Guggenheim dynasty, regarded her with suspicion. They had built institutions of solemn grandeur, museums and foundations draped in the dignity of philanthropy. Peggy, by contrast, had lived among exiles, slept with poets, gambled her inheritance on canvases that respectable society once despised. To them, she seemed reckless, even embarrassing. Whispers circulated that her collection was less a monument to art than a gallery of lovers' tributes, purchased with poor judgment and poorer taste. They envied its value even as they mocked its origins. Peggy, behind her glasses, laughed at their disdain, but inside she feared their power. She knew that once she was gone, her collection might be claimed, dismantled, or stripped of the spirit she had poured into it. Critics, too, sharpened their pens. Some hailed her as a genius of instinct, a woman who had preserved what others had ignored, who had shifted the very axis of art from Europe to America. Others dismissed her as shallow, claiming she bought art as she bought affection, impulsively without understanding. They accused her of vulgarity, of mixing patronage with desire, of blurring the sacred line between art and body. Peggy, who had always lived in scandal, endured the accusations with her usual wit, but the sting remained. For beneath the legend of eccentricity was a woman who longed to be taken seriously, who wanted to be remembered not only for her affairs, but for her vision. She did little to quiet the scandals, for scandal had long been her language. She spoke openly of her lovers, often with mocking laughter, naming names as though daring the world to recoil. She wore her eccentricities boldly, surrounding herself with her dogs, drifting through Venice in her gondola like a figure in a surrealist painting. Some admired her defiance, others ridiculed it, but all remembered it. Peggy seemed to understand that memory was less about purity than about presence. Better to be remembered as scandalous than to vanish as respectable. Yet in private, doubts gnawed. She asked herself whether her life had been meaningful, whether her collection would endure, whether people would see her as more than the caricature they repeated in gossip. She feared that her name would be forgotten even as her paintings survived, that she herself would dissolve into the legend of her eccentricity. She once remarked that she had lived not for herself but for her collection, and perhaps it was true. The art had given her identity, purpose, survival. But had it been enough? In Venice, disputes arose even as she lived. Some called her palazzo a sanctuary, others called it a circus. Her arrangement of works based on instinct rather than scholarship was criticized as chaotic, even disrespectful. Traditional curators insisted the masterpieces deserved solemn halls and reverent distance. Peggy refused. She wanted her art to live among people, to breathe in domestic spaces, to unsettle rather than console. To walk her palazzo was to walk into Peggy's mind, fragmented, impulsive, restless. To some, this was genius. To others, vulgarity. The judgment was as divided as her life had always been. Family conflicts sharpened with time. Her relatives demanded control. Lawyers whispered of wills. Newspapers speculated about inheritance. Peggy, who had long since learned to trust no one fully, grew guarded, her wit more biting, her eccentricities more pronounced. She clung to her collection as though it were her very flesh, unwilling to imagine it torn apart by those who had never believed in it. She spoke often of her fear that after her death, her vision would be diluted, her palace stripped, her art scattered. The thought haunted her, though she masked it with laughter. And yet, for all the disputes and accusations, Peggy knew that her collection had already achieved something undeniable. Visitors streamed through her palazzo, their eyes widening before Pollock's splatters, Ernst's dreamscapes, Brancusi's smooth forms. Young artists whispered of inspiration, tourists marveled at the strangeness, critics grudgingly admitted the significance. Whatever they said of Peggy herself, the art could not be ignored. She had carried it through wars, scandals, betrayals, and loss, and here it stood, vibrant and alive. That was her triumph, though she herself never ceased to wonder whether triumph and failure were not two sides of the same coin. As the years advanced, her body weakened. She walked more slowly, leaned more heavily on her gondoliers, spent longer hours seated among her dogs. But her wit remained sharp, her defiance undimmed. She continued to receive visitors, to shock them with her candor, to dismiss solemnity with laughter. Eccentricity had become not only armor but legacy, a way of ensuring that she would be remembered in color rather than in gray. And so we close this chapter with the image of Peggy sitting once more in the great hall of her palazzo, a visitor daring to ask whether she considered herself a serious figure in the history of art. Peggy pauses, her glasses reflecting the light, her dogs shifting at her feet. She replies with a sharp remark, half mocking, half true, that she had done what the men had failed to do. She had saved the art they had dismissed. The visitor laughs nervously, uncertain whether she is serious. Peggy says nothing more. She leans back, silent now, the question unresolved. Outside, the canal carries the faint echo of oars, and inside her paintings wait, their verdict eternal, even if her own remains uncertain. The visitor's nervous laughter lingered for a moment, echoing faintly against the marble walls, then dissolved into the silence that always returned after questions Peggy refused to answer. She leaned back in her chair, her dogs pressing close, as if sensing the fatigue behind her wit. The paintings stared down from the walls, unchanging, their colors fixed in defiance of time. Peggy, by contrast, felt time pressing upon her with ever greater weight. The sharpness of her tongue remained, but her body weakened, her steps slowed, her solitude deepened. The palazzo that had once been a living theater of scandal and laughter grew more and more like a mausoleum, a house where beauty survived, but voices faded. Venice itself mirrored her decline. The city was beautiful still, shimmering with water and light, but beneath its splendor lay decay. Palaces crumbled, canals thickened with silt. Stone stairways eroded under centuries of tides. Peggy felt kinship with the city. Both had once been centers of vitality. Both now wore their age with dignity mixed with fragility. Both had become objects of admiration and melancholy. Each morning, as she opened her shutters to the canal, she saw herself reflected in the city's fading grandeur, and she accepted the parallel with a kind of grim amusement. Her life grew quieter, though visitors continued to come. Tourists arrived by gondola, eager to glimpse the woman in dark glasses surrounded by her collection. Artists and critics still sought her approval, though with less urgency now, for she was no longer the gatekeeper she had once been. She received them in her hall, her wit intact, her eccentricities undiminished, but afterward the rooms grew silent again, and she was left with only her dogs and her memories. The palace filled with the ghosts of those who had once crowded its spaces, Pollock splashing paint in a frenzy, Ernst laughing with theatrical charm, Breton lecturing like a prophet, Beckett silent in the corner, Pagan moving quietly through the rooms. All gone, all shadows now, their absence louder than the visitors' chatter. Her dogs remained her truest companions. She adored them, doted on them, spoke of them with more affection than she gave to most people. She once remarked, half in jest, that animals had been more loyal to her than any man. It was not simply a joke. The dogs offered her the constancy she had never found in lovers, never fully found even in her own daughter. They were present, unquestioning, their devotion uncomplicated. When she died, she asked to be buried beside them, as though their loyalty had bound her more deeply than the betrayals and silences of humans ever could. The palazzo itself began to feel like a tomb of beauty. Masterpieces covered the walls, treasures preserved against war and ridicule, visions that had once been new and shocking, but were now established, revered, tamed. Peggy sometimes confessed to feeling estranged from her own collection. The works had outgrown her. They belonged to the world now, not only to her. Visitors came to marvel at Picasso, Ernst, Brancusi, Pollock, scarcely noticing the woman who had gathered them. She had preserved their art, but had she preserved herself? The question haunted her. Her health declined. She moved more slowly, sometimes withdrawing entirely from company, leaving her staff to guide visitors through the collection. The palazzo echoed with footsteps not her own, voices not hers, laughter that did not belong to her. She became a presence half seen, glimpsed in a hallway seated in shadow, her glasses concealing her eyes, her dogs close at her side. To those who saw her, she seemed already half a ghost, living among her paintings as though she had merged with them. Yet even in her solitude, her defiance remained. She refused to surrender to bitterness, refused to apologize for her scandals, refused to deny the eccentricities that had defined her. She continued to laugh, though the laughter was softer now, and to mock, though her words carried less sting. She remained Peggy, diminished in body, perhaps, but unbroken in spirit. The armor she had forged through decades of scandal, wit, and eccentricity held firm, even as time pressed harder. At night, the palazzo was quiet except for the faint splash of oars on the canal, the distant murmur of gondoliers calling to one another. Peggy lay awake often, listening to those sounds, remembering. She remembered the smoky cafes of Paris, the violent laughter of Lawrence, the silences of Beckett, the flamboyance of Ernst, the chaos of Pollock, the delicate sadness of Peggy. Each memory arrived like a ghost, stepping softly through her room. She did not chase them away. She let them linger, companions of another kind, filling the silence with their absence. Her greatest fear remained the fate of her collection. She knew her family would fight for it, that critics would argue over it, that institutions would try to claim it. She feared that what she had built through instinct and risk would be diluted by bureaucracy, stripped of the eccentricity that gave it life. She wanted her palazzo to remain as she had made it, not as a sterile museum, but as a home where art breathed. Yet she also knew she could not control what would happen after her death. The thought unsettled her, though she masked it with the same shrug and laughter she had used all her life. And so we end this chapter with the image of Peggy seated in her Venetian palazzo in her final years, her glasses large, her body frail, her dogs pressed close against her. Around her, the walls blaze with color, with forms born of chaos and defiance, with visions she alone had preserved. The room feels at once alive and sepulchral, a mausoleum of beauty where the past breathes faintly but insistently. Outside, a gondola passes, its oar creaking softly in the dusk. Inside, Peggy sits in silence, her figure small beneath the weight of her collection, her kingdom both triumph and tomb. The gondola's oar creaked softly in the dusk, its sound fading as it slipped past the palazzo, leaving Peggy once more in the stillness of her own hall. The walls blazed with color, but she felt herself growing dimmer, her body frail, her steps unsteady. Each year, she moved less, spoke less, relying more on her staff to guide visitors through the collection that had become her kingdom. She lingered in her chair with her dogs close at her feet, her dark glasses shielding eyes grown tired. She had outlived so many lovers, friends, rivals, even her own daughter. Now she sat among the survivors that could not speak back, her paintings and her dogs, the only companions who remained unchanged. In her final years, the palazzo had the atmosphere of a shrine. Tourists still arrived, their voices filling the rooms with wonder and confusion. But Peggy herself appeared less often, glimpsed briefly in a doorway or seated quietly in the shadows. To them, she was already half a myth, the eccentric widow of modernism, the strange queen who lived among dogs and masterpieces. She watched them sometimes, unseen, and wondered what they made of her, whether they saw the woman at all, or only the legend wrapped around her like another garment. Her health declined steadily. The vitality that had once carried her across oceans, through wars and scandals, was ebbing. Yet she did not surrender easily. She continued to host small gatherings, continued to laugh with a sharp wit when strength allowed, continued to cherish her dogs as though they were her last proof of love. But she knew the end was approaching. She spoke of it rarely, and when she did, it was often with the same mocking humor that had shielded her all her life. She claimed she feared nothing, that she had already seen too much of death to tremble at its approach. Yet those who knew her well suspected otherwise, that beneath the laughter lay the same old fear of abandonment, of vanishing into silence without being truly remembered. In 1979, the silence she had always dreaded finally came. Peggy died in her Venetian palazzo, surrounded not by family but by her dogs and her art. She was 81 years old. Her death was quiet, without the scandal that had marked so much of her life. But even in dying, she remained herself, an eccentric figure who left behind not orderly accounts or careful legacies, but a house filled with the voices of paintings. Her burial followed her wishes. She was laid to rest in the garden of her palazzo beside the graves of her beloved dogs. Their small stones marked each life she had cherished more faithfully than most of her human loves. Visitors who walk through the garden today see them lined neatly, the names of her pets carved simply, their presence a quiet testament to the loyalty that had never betrayed her. Beside them, Peggy's grave carries her name without grandeur, a modest marker in the shadow of the palazzo she had filled with the great art of the century. There is something both tender and tragic in this resting place. The woman who had sought passion across continents, who had loved fiercely and been betrayed often, who had gathered around her the most scandalous and brilliant artists of her time, lay at last in silence beside her dogs, as though confessing that in them she had found the only unconditional love of her life. The palazzo stood above her, its walls filled with works that spoke louder than any eulogy. Her collection was her monument, her defiance, her confession. After her death, debates flared immediately. Family members and critics argued over the fate of her collection. Institutions sought control. Journalists speculated on her legacy. Was she to be remembered as a visionary collector or dismissed as a scandalous socialite? Was her collection to be treated as museum or as eccentric relic of one woman's whims? Peggy herself had feared this, had known that her death would unleash disputes, yet she could do nothing more. She had left her palazzo behind, filled with the paintings she had chosen, arranged by instinct rather than scholarship, and it was for the living to decide what to do. In Venice, the city she had chosen as her final home, the waters carried whispers of her passing. Gondoliers spoke of her as the eccentric signora with the dogs. Critics wrote of her as a daring patron who had preserved modernism through its darkest hours. Friends remembered her wit, her laughter, her sharp tongue. Lovers remembered her passion, her hunger, her wounds. Few agreed on who Peggy Guggenheim truly was, but all admitted she had left a mark that could not be erased. And so we close this chapter with the image of her garden at dusk, the stones of her dogs' graves lined neatly, her own stone among them, the marble cool in the evening air. The palazzo rises silent above, its windows catching the last light of the day, its walls alive with the art she saved. The city around her murmurs with water and footsteps, but in the garden there is only stillness. Peggy lies there now, at rest at last, her life of scandal and passion folded into silence, her kingdom of art watching over her as her final witness. The stones in her garden gleamed faintly in the Venetian dusk, her name etched among the smaller names of her beloved dogs, the palazzo rising above like a guardian of silence. Peggy lay there now, the scandals of her life stilled, her laughter and sharp tongue vanished into the air, yet the walls of her unfinished palace did not fall quiet. They continued to speak more loudly with each passing year, as though the paintings themselves had assumed her role, telling the story she could no longer tell. For after Peggy's death, her collection lived on, and in its survival her life was carried forward in ways even she might not have imagined. Visitors began to arrive in greater numbers than ever before. They came by gondola, stepping onto the marble floors of the palazzo where her dogs had once padded and where Peggy herself had once laughed at their questions. Now they walked through the rooms as through a sanctuary, gazing at Brancusi's smooth forms, at Ernst's dreamscapes, at Pollock's wild splatters, at Kandinsky's geometries, at Miraut's whimsical signs. The collection she had assembled by instinct, often mocked, often dismissed, had become one of the most important in the world. Critics who had sneered at her vulgarity now spoke of her vision with respect, though perhaps with a touch of reluctance, as though still unwilling to admit that she had been right. The palazzo itself became a museum, open not only to the artists and friends she once welcomed, but to strangers from across the world. Each year, hundreds of thousands came, their voices filling the rooms, their footsteps echoing on the marble. The palazzo no longer belonged to Peggy alone. It had become a shared memory, a place where the art of the 20th century could be encountered not in sterile halls, but in the eccentric setting she had created. Her vision, instinctive and personal, became public legacy. The eccentricity she had once been mocked for was now praised as innovation. And yet, as visitors moved through her rooms, many wondered about the woman herself. Who was Peggy Guggenheim? Was she simply the eccentric hostess they glimpsed in photographs, the woman in dark glasses surrounded by dogs? Was she a patron of genius, or a scandalous heiress chasing passions across continents? Was her collection the product of vision or of whims born out of longing? The questions lingered, unresolved, just as she had left them. Peggy had never offered definitive answers, never explained herself beyond wit and laughter, and so her legacy remained ambiguous, suspended between admiration and curiosity. Some saw her as savior of modern art, the woman who had carried surrealism and abstract expressionism through war, who had given Pollock his chance, who had preserved Ernst, Miraut, and Brancusi when others abandoned them. Others saw her as a woman driven by personal hunger, who collected as she loved, impulsively, recklessly, passionately, without plan. Still others reduced her to her scandals, to her affairs and eccentricities, treating her collection as little more than a gallery of lovers' tributes. The truth, perhaps, lay in the blend. Peggy was all of these at once, visionary and scandalous, patron and seeker, eccentric and essential. The irony of her life is that what she feared most has not come to pass. She had dreaded being forgotten, feared that her family would scatter her collection, that her eccentricities would erase her seriousness. Instead, her palazzo remains intact, her collection preserved as she arranged it, her name spoken daily by strangers who marvel at what she saved. She lies in the garden, unseen, but her presence is everywhere within those walls. The dogs she adored rest beside her, their graves modest, their loyalty eternal. The visitors step past them, sometimes unaware, sometimes pausing in quiet recognition, then enter the halls where her life's work still glimmers. And yet, one might ask, what is Peggy's true legacy? Is it the art itself, the paintings and sculptures she preserved for the world? Or is it the example of her life, the way she transformed absence and scandal into creation, the way she defied convention and lived entirely on her own terms? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps the collection cannot be separated from the life that shaped it. Without her hunger, her wounds, her recklessness, her need for love, the collection would not exist. The scandals, the losses, the eccentricities, all were part of the soil in which the art was rooted. To erase them would be to misunderstand the garden entirely. Even now, as millions pass through her palazzo, her story remains unresolved. Some leave speaking only of the paintings. Others leave whispering about the woman in dark glasses who gathered them. Few leave untouched, for the place carries a weight beyond its walls, a sense of a life that was both chaotic and essential. Peggy Guggenheim remains present not in her grave, nor in her photographs, but in the dialogue between her collection and the silence she left behind. And so we close her story with the image of her garden at night, the waters of the canal lapping gently against the stones, the palazzo glowing faintly in the moonlight. The graves of her dogs line the path, her own name resting quietly among them. Beyond the garden walls, the paintings wait, alive with color, defiant against time. Peggy is gone, but her kingdom endures. Was she queen, or was she captive? Was she savior, or was she simply seeker? The answer is left to the silence, to the water, to the canvases that whisper still.